The desert is a strange place at night. It's a vast, empty landscape where the wind whispers through the cracks of forgotten buildings, and the stars shine coldly overhead, indifferent to what lurks below. For those stationed at the National Training Center (NTC) in Fort Irwin, California, the silence isn't peaceful, it's unsettling. There are stories, passed down through generations of soldiers, about things that move in the darkness, things that don't belong. Most laugh them off. But some have seen too much to laugh. Jake wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He was a combat veteran, used to high-pressure situations, and had spent enough time in the military to know that fear was usually just a trick of the mind. But there was something different about the NTC. It wasn't just the isolation or the eerie quiet that stretched for miles. It was the feeling. The way the air seemed thicker at night, the way shadows stretched a little too long, the way something always seemed to be watching. It started with a training exercise deep in the Mojave. Jake's unit had been deployed to simulate combat in the rough desert terrain, practicing maneuvers under the harsh sun. But as night fell, the desert transformed. The familiar landmarks disappeared in the dark, and even the most seasoned soldiers found themselves glancing over their shoulders, sensing something just out of sight. They had set up camp near an abandoned outpost, a place no one wanted to stay for long. The older guys warned them, never go off alone at night, and if you hear something calling your name from the desert, don't answer. First it was easy to laugh it off. Just another campfire tale. But when the radio started picking up strange interference, when the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the empty night, the laughter stopped. Then came the voices. Low, distorted, and impossible to pinpoint, they seemed to drift in from the darkness. Sometimes they sounded familiar. Too familiar. One night, as Jake stood watch, he heard it. His own name. Soft, just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. His heart pounded, but he held his ground, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Just the wind. But the wind didn't sound like a person whispering his name. The next morning one of their guys, Alvarez, was gone. No tracks, no sign of struggle, just gone. His gear was still in his tent, his rifle untouched. The search went on for days, but it was like he had vanished into thin air. And then the last radio message came through. Crackling, barely audible over the static, but clear enough to send a chill down Jake's spine. It's not him. Don't trust it. The radio went silent, and the desert held its secrets. The radio message lingered in Jake's mind long after the static had faded. It's not him. Don't trust it. He replayed it over and over, trying to convince himself that maybe he had misheard, that maybe it was just interference or a sick joke. But deep down he knew better. Alvarez was gone, and now something was telling them not to trust what, or who might come back. The official report was as expected. They scoured the area, combed through every inch of desert within a 5-mile radius, but there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no gear misplaced. Just an empty tent, like Alvarez had stepped outside for a smoke and simply never came back. The higher-ups wrote it off as disorientation, heat exhaustion, maybe even desertion. They said he'd probably wandered off in the middle of the night. But Jake knew that didn't make sense. Not for Alvarez. That night, the air was heavy, thicker than usual. The usual desert breeze had died down, leaving everything too still, too quiet. The guys sat around in a tight circle, whispering about what happened, none of them wanting to admit how on edge they felt. Even their sergeant, a man who never let anything rattle him, kept glancing toward the empty tent. Then, around midnight it happened. The sound of boots crunching against the dirt. Low, steady, moving toward camp. Jake's hand instinctively went to his rifle, and he wasn't the only one. The others sat frozen, listening, waiting. Then, from the darkness, a shadow appeared. A lone figure walking toward them. No flashlight, no gear. Just a silhouette barely illuminated by the dim moonlight. First no one spoke. No one breathed. Then someone muttered, "No way." It was Alvarez. Or at least it looked like him. He stepped into the edge of the firelight, his face calm, expression blank. He was wearing the same uniform, the same boots, the same patches. But there was something off. His posture was too stiff, his movements too slow, too deliberate, like he was adjusting to a body he wasn't used to. And his eyes, dark, hollow, weren't quite right. Alvarez. Jake's voice came out uncertain, his grip tightening on his rifle. The figure smiled, a small, unnatural curve of the lips. "Yeah," he said. His voice was flat, empty, like it wasn't really his. "What's wrong?" No one spoke. No one moved. Then one of the guys, Cooper, swallowed hard and asked, "Where the hell have you been, man?" Alvarez, or whatever this was, tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he laughed, a dry, forced sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "Got lost," he said. "Desert does that, you know." No one answered. Jake could feel it now, something deep in his gut telling him that this wasn't right. That this wasn't Alvarez. And then he remembered the radio. "It's not him. Don't trust it." Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He exchanged glances with the others, each one of them seeing the same unease reflected back. Alvarez stood there, just outside the fire's glow, watching them, waiting. Finally, their sergeant cleared his throat and stood. "All right, Alvarez," he said, keeping his voice even. "Let's get you checked out." For a second, the thing wearing Alvarez's face didn't react. Then, slowly, it nodded. But as it stepped closer, Jake saw it. The thing that made his blood run cold. Alvarez's boots. They were clean. Too clean. They had been searching for him for days, out in the desert, through dust and sand, through rough terrain. His boots should have been worn down, caked with dirt. But they weren't. They looked fresh, untouched, as if he had never taken a step out there at all. Jake forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. This wasn't Alvarez. But he couldn't say that. Not yet. Instead, he kept quiet as their sergeant led Alvarez away, keeping him separate from the rest of the group. No one slept that night. Every time the wind rustled the tent flaps, every time a coyote howled in the distance, Jake felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. By morning, things had only gotten worse. Alvarez was different. He didn't talk much. Didn't eat. He just sat there staring at nothing, barely blinking. And then there were the little things. His voice just slightly off. His movements just a little too rigid. And the way he watched them. By the second night, Jake knew they had to do something. They couldn't just pretend this was normal. Then, something happened that made any lingering doubt disappear. One of the other guys, Monroe, was coming back from the latrine when he stopped short, frozen in place. He was staring at something just beyond the tents, something half hidden in the darkness. Jake followed his gaze, and his stomach dropped. There, just barely visible under the pale glow of the moon, stood another Alvarez. Identical. Same uniform. Same face. Standing at the edge of camp. Watching. Jake barely had time to react before Monroe let out a strangled noise and stumbled backward, scrambling away from the thing in the shadows. It didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilting slightly. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked back into the desert. Jake's blood ran ice cold. Because if that was Alvarez, then what the hell was inside their tent? No one said a word as Monroe ran back to them, breathless and pale. But they didn't need to. They all knew now. The thing in their camp wasn't Alvarez. And whatever was out there in the desert wasn't done with them yet. Jake's hands were ice cold despite the desert heat pressing in around them. No one moved, no one spoke. The reality of what they had just seen settled over them like a suffocating weight. There had been two of them. Two Alvarezes. One standing in their camp. One watching from the darkness. For a long time, the group sat in tense silence, staring at the tent where Alvarez had gone to sleep, or whatever it did when they weren't looking. Nobody was willing to go in there. Nobody wanted to be the one to look it in the eyes again. Then their sergeant made a decision. "We're keeping watch tonight," he said, voice low. "No one goes anywhere alone. Nobody argued. Jake was paired with Monroe, the guy who had seen the second Alvarez. They took the first shift, sitting on the outskirts of the camp, rifles resting across their laps. Monroe was still shaken, his leg bouncing restlessly as he kept glancing over his shoulder. "You saw it too, right?" Monroe finally whispered. "I didn't imagine that." Jake swallowed, his throat dry. "You didn't imagine it." Monroe exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Then what the hell is in that tent?" Jake didn't have an answer. Hours passed, the desert stretching out in endless silence. The stars above seemed colder than usual, distant and uncaring. They listened for sounds, footsteps, whispers, anything, but the night remained eerily still. Then, sometime past 3 in the morning, a noise broke the silence. Not from outside the camp. From Alvarez's tent. A slow, wet sound like something stretching. Bones popping. Skin shifting. Jake stiffened, gripping his rifle tighter. Monroe turned toward the tent, his breath coming out in shallow bursts. Then a movement. The flap of the tent shifted. Something was coming out. The figure stepped into the dim glow of the lantern light, its silhouette familiar yet wrong. It was Alvarez. At least it had Alvarez's face. But the way it moved, it wasn't human. Its shoulders hunched too far forward, its limbs too stiff, like it was still adjusting to the body it was wearing. Jake didn't move. Neither did Monroe. They just watched. The thing turned its head slightly, its dark, empty eyes locking onto them. Then slowly it smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. Neither of them breathed. Then, without a word, the thing turned and walked out of camp. Not into the latrine. Not toward the supply area. Into the desert. Disappearing into the darkness without a sound. For a moment Jake and Monroe just sat there staring. Then finally Monroe whispered, "What do we do?" Jake didn't have an answer. At sunrise, Alvarez's tent was empty. His gear was still there, his boots neatly placed by the entrance. But he was gone. Again. And no one dared to go looking for him. The sergeant called for an early morning briefing, gathering the remaining men in a tight circle. Everyone looked exhausted, faces drawn and tense. No one spoke about what they had seen the night before, but they didn't have to. "We're packing up," the sergeant said firmly. "This exercise is over." There was no argument. Within an hour they had their gear loaded up, ready to move. But as they were breaking down the last of the tents, one of the guys, Cooper, froze, his face pale. Sarge." His voice was unsteady. Jake turned and felt his stomach drop. Bootprints. Leading away from Alvarez's tent. But they weren't normal. They started off as regular footprints, military-issue boots pressing into the dirt. But a few yards out they changed. The stride lengthened. The impressions grew deeper. The shape shifted. By the time the tracks disappeared into the desert, they weren't boot prints anymore. They were something else entirely. Something with claws. A chill ran down Jake's spine. He could feel the others looking at each other, their unspoken fear settling between them. They all knew what they had seen, but no one wanted to be the one to say it. Instead, they finished packing, working faster now, an urgency driving them forward. They needed to leave. As the convoy rolled out, Jake sat in the back of one of the Humvees, watching the desert blur past. He told himself they were safe now, that whatever was out there wasn't following them. But deep down he knew better. Because when he glanced back one last time, far in the distance, standing just at the edge of the heat mirage, was a figure. Butching. Smiling. The ride back to base was tense, the hum of the Humvee's engine the only sound filling the space between them. No one spoke. No one dared to. They all felt it, that lingering presence, the weight of something watching them even as they left the training grounds behind. Jake sat rigid, his back pressed against the worn seat, eyes locked on the desert fading into the distance. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see it again. But he knew. It was still there. They reached Fort Irwin just after sunset, the last traces of daylight bleeding away into the horizon. The base, usually a place of order and structure, felt different this time. Too quiet. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting, but instead, the air was thick with something unspoken. A feeling that whatever they had encountered out there in the desert, it hadn't stayed behind. As they filed out of the vehicles, their sergeant was quick to dismiss them. No debrief, no discussions. Just a simple order. Get some rest. But Jake doubted anyone would sleep tonight. He made his way to the barracks, his boots echoing against the concrete as he pushed open the door. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. He tossed his gear onto his bunk, rubbing his hands over his face, trying to shake the exhaustion clawing at him. But his mind wouldn't let go of the image. Alvarez, or whatever had been wearing his face, grinning in the darkness. Jake turned toward the mirror near his bunk, his reflection staring back at him, tired and hollow-eyed. He let out a breath and reached for the faucet, splashing cold water onto his face. For a moment, the feeling of the cool water grounded him. Then he heard it. Voice. Familiar. Jake. His blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from outside. He turned sharply, his pulse hammering. The barracks window overlooked the edge of the base, where the desert stretched on endlessly. The wind had picked up, kicking dust into the air, but there was no one there. Jake. The voice was closer now. Low. Distorted. Sounded like Alvarez. But Jake knew better. His hands tightened into fists. His breathing was shallow, every nerve in his body screaming at him to move, to run, to do anything but stay rooted in place. Then, just as he reached for the light switch, a shadow passed by the window. Not a person. Not human. Something taller, thinner, its limbs too long, its movements too unnatural. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs as he staggered back, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife strapped to his belt. But by the time he turned back toward the window, the shadow was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. And a knock. Low. Deliberate. Coming from the door. Jake didn't move. The knock came again, harder this time. He could feel the air change, the pressure in the room shifting. His fingers curled tighter around the handle of his knife. Every instinct told him not to open it. Then a voice from the other side. It's me. Alvarez. But that was impossible. Jake's grip tightened, his knuckles white. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay still, to breathe. Long pause. Then the voice again, this time softer, almost pleading. Open the door, man. Something's out here. A chill crawled down Jake's spine. Something was out there. But it wasn't Alvarez. He stepped back, his pulse thundering in his ears. He wouldn't open the door. He couldn't. Then suddenly the knocking stopped. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural. Jake strained to hear anything beyond the pounding of his own heartbeat. Then footsteps, low, dragging, moving away from his door. And in the distance, carried on the desert wind, a sound that didn't belong. A low, guttural laugh. Jake didn't sleep that night. By morning, things only got worse. He wasn't the only one who had heard the knocking. Monroe, Cooper, even the sergeant. They all had the same story. A voice outside their doors. Knock. Something waiting in the dark. And when they checked the security cameras near the barracks, nothing was there. No movement. No figures. But the audio picked up something. A faint whisper right outside each of their rooms. It's not him. The same warning from the radio in the desert. Jake knew now. Had followed them back. And it wasn't done with them yet. The base felt different now. Like the walls weren't enough to keep whatever was out there from creeping in. Jake could see it in the others too. Monroe, Cooper, even the sergeant. No one said it out loud, but they all carried the same haunted look in their eyes. The feeling that no matter how far they'd come from the desert, they hadn't left it behind. That night, the fear settled deeper, like a heavy weight pressing on Jake's chest. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to every small creak and rustle. He told himself it was just his nerves, that nothing was coming back. Then, around 2 a.m., his radio crackled to life. First it was just static. A low hum of white noise, barely noticeable. Then a voice. Not clear. Not quite human. Jake. His entire body tensed. It's not safe. The voice warbled, glitching in and out, distorting like a bad signal. Don't trust it. Sharp click. Then silence. Jake shot upright, his pulse hammering. His radio wasn't even on. The room around him was still. Too still. The kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then his door handle moved. A slow, deliberate twist. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he reached for the knife under his pillow. He didn't move, didn't blink. Just listened. Pause. Then 3 knocks. Hard. Hello. Just like before. A voice followed, low and tired. Jake, it's me. Open up. Alvarez. Jake squeezed his eyes shut. Whoa. It wasn't Alvarez. It couldn't be. But the voice on the other side of that door sounded just like him. Then something changed. The voice shifted. Come on, man. Why are you scared? A hint of amusement now, like it knew something he didn't. Let me in. The words slithered through the air, and for a second, just a second, Jake felt his body move on its own. His fingers twitched toward the handle. His mind clouded with something thick and heavy, a pull he couldn't explain. Then, just as suddenly, the feeling was gone. The doorknob twisted one last time. Then a silence. Jake didn't sleep after that. By morning, the entire base was on edge. 'Cause it wasn't just Jake this time. Half the guys had heard it. The knocking. Voice. And worse. Someone had let it in. The rumors spread fast. A soldier from another unit, someone Jake barely knew, had been found wandering near the edge of the base at dawn. Barefoot. Shaking. Eyes wide and unfocused. Whispering things no one could understand. They took him to medical, but no one had answers. Then Monroe came to him, pale and shaken. You need to see this. Jake followed him across the barracks to where a group of guys stood in a tight huddle, their faces pale. The moment Monroe pulled him forward, Jake's stomach dropped. On the ground just outside their building were footprints. Not just boot prints, bare feet. Deep, clawed impressions in the dirt. And there were too many. Like something had been circling their rooms all night, waiting. Then Jake noticed something else. In the middle of the tracks was a single set of boot prints. And the name on the tag of the soldier who had been found wandering. Alvarez. But Alvarez was gone. Had been for days. So who or what had come back? The morning air was thick with unease. The footprints, both human and not, were already half faded in the wind, but the memory of them burned fresh in Jake's mind. The entire base seemed gripped by an invisible hand, an unspoken fear settling deep into the bones of every man who had seen them. No one wanted to say it out loud, but they all knew. Alvarez had come back. Or something pretending to be him had. Jake and Monroe stood near the edge of the tracks, their boots pressed into the dry dirt, staring at the marks that led toward the perimeter fence. The wind whistled softly, sending small waves of sand rolling over the ground. Felt wrong, like the desert was breathing. Then, from behind them, a commotion. A group of soldiers rushed past, heading toward medical. Someone shouted for the sergeant. The energy shifted, something was happening. Jake and Monroe exchanged a look before taking off, their boots slamming against the pavement as they pushed their way through the growing crowd outside the infirmary. Inside, the soldier who had been found wandering the night before was sitting upright in bed, staring blankly ahead. His skin was pale, his lips dry and cracked. Sweat rolled down his face, but his eyes, they weren't right. The sergeant stood next to him, tense, jaw clenched, arms crossed tight over his chest. He looked at the medic, then at the soldier. Tell them what you told me. The room went still. The soldier swallowed hard, his throat clicking. When he spoke, his voice was flat, mechanical. I saw him. No one breathed. He's still out there. The word sent a chill down Jake's spine. The sergeant's voice was sharp. Who? The soldier blinked, his gaze distant, unfocused. Alvarez. His lips barely moved. He was standing outside the fence. Jake felt Monroe shift beside him, his body stiffening. The soldier continued, his voice quieter now. He smiled at me. Long pause. But it wasn't him. Something about the way he said it sent an invisible weight pressing down on the room. The sergeant exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face before looking back at the medic. Keep him here. Then, turning to the group of soldiers, his voice was firm. Gear up. We're checking the perimeter. Jake's stomach twisted, but he didn't hesitate. He and Monroe grabbed their rifles and followed the others, the tension thick between them. By the time they reached the outer fence, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the ground. They spread out in a line, scanning the landscape, their movements sharp and cautious. Then Monroe's voice came through the radio, low and urgent. Got something. Jake turned, heart pounding. Monroe was standing a few yards ahead, near a section of the fence where the sand had been disturbed. Footprints. Leading from the desert. Jake swallowed hard, stepping closer. Where do they go? Monroe didn't answer. He was still staring at the prints. Jake followed his gaze. The footprints didn't stop at the fence. They passed right through it. The metal wiring was intact, untouched. No breaks, no openings. And yet, the tracks were on both sides. Something had walked straight through. A sound carried on the wind then. A distant whisper, faint but unmistakable. Voice. Jake. His blood turned to ice. The radio crackled. It's not him. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He turned sharply, scanning the desert beyond the fence, every nerve in his body screaming for him to move, to run. Then he saw it. Far in the distance, standing perfectly still in the fading light. Figure. Motionless. Butching. Alvarez. Or at least something that looked like him. The shape was right. The uniform was right. But the posture, too stiff, too unnatural. Then, as if sensing Jake's stare, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, took a step forward. Then another. And then, it smiled. The same wide, unnatural grin Jake had seen that night in the desert. Something inside him snapped. Go! The order barely left his mouth before the figure dropped to all fours. And charged. The thing moved fast. Too fast for something that looked human. The soldiers opened fire, the crack of gunshots splitting the air, but the figure barely slowed. It was coming straight for them. Jake barely had time to react before Monroe grabbed his arm, yanking him backward. Fall back. They ran. The base wasn't far, but it felt like miles. The air burned in Jake's lungs, his legs pushing harder than they ever had before. Behind them the gunfire stopped, and so did the thing. Jake risked a glance back. It was gone. The desert was empty. The tracks in the sand ended abruptly, as if the thing had simply vanished. For a long moment no one spoke. No one moved. They were all thinking the same thing. It wasn't over. And it never would be. Jake looked out at the endless stretch of desert, his heart still hammering. Somewhere out there, in the shifting sands and empty night, it was still watching, still waiting. And next time, it wouldn't knock. The air felt heavier than before. The desert stretched out before them, empty and silent, but none of them could shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The wind had picked up, sweeping across the sand, erasing the last traces of the tracks that had led straight through the fence. It was as if whatever had been there had never existed. But Jake knew better. They all did. Back at the base, the soldiers moved in tense silence. No one spoke about what they had seen. No one wanted to. Some went straight to their bunks, locking their doors, pretending the night hadn't happened. Others sat in small groups, whispering in hushed tones, their faces pale. Jake and Monroe stayed outside, standing near the barracks, their eyes still fixed on the darkened horizon. You saw it, right? Monroe finally asked. his voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded. Yeah. Monroe exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. What the hell was that thing? Jake didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure anyone did. The higher-ups had already begun doing what they did best, covering it up. The soldier from medical had been quietly transferred out the next morning. His condition marked as unexplained psychosis. The footprints dismissed as a trick of the wind. The thing they had all seen. Nothing but paranoia, brought on by exhaustion and stress. Officially, nothing had happened. But unofficially, Jake knew the truth. They all did. For the next few nights, sleep was impossible. Even when exhaustion weighed on him. His body refused to let go. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind outside made his skin crawl. He wasn't alone. Some of the men kept their weapons close, refusing to leave their barracks after dark. Others volunteered for extra shifts, anything to avoid being alone in the quiet hours of the night. It was Monroe who finally broke the silence between them again. They sat outside, the night air cool against their skin, staring out at the empty land beyond the fence. I looked up the stories, Monroe said suddenly. The ones about this place. Jake turned his head slightly. And Monroe let out a dry laugh. And apparently, this has been happening for years. He shifted uncomfortably, picking at the strap of his rifle. Soldiers seeing things, hearing voices, people going missing. They don't talk about it, but it's there if you dig deep enough. Jake frowned. You think the higher-ups know? Monroe nodded. They have to. You don't just ignore something like this for decades unless you're trying to keep it quiet. The thought made Jake's stomach twist. They were being kept in the dark, left to figure out for themselves what was out there. A few weeks passed and slowly the tension on base began to fade. The men didn't forget, but they pushed it down, burying it beneath the routine of training and duty. The desert had a way of making people question what they saw, what they believed. Maybe that was part of its power. One night Monroe packed his bags. Got my orders, he said, throwing a duffel over his shoulder. Heading out tomorrow. Jake nodded, feeling an unexpected heaviness settle over him. You tell anyone what happened? Monroe gave him a knowing look. Would you believe me if I did? Jake didn't answer. As Monroe turned to leave, he hesitated. You should get out of here too, man. Jake forced a smirk. Running from ghosts. Monroe shook his head. Running from whatever's out there. He glanced back at the empty desert one last time before walking off. Jake watched him go, a strange feeling creeping into his chest. A part of him wanted to leave too. Pack up and never look back. But he also knew it wouldn't matter. Because whatever was out there, it wasn't bound to this place. It had followed them before. Could follow them again. And some doors once opened don't close. That night, as Jake lay in his bunk, he finally felt sleep creeping in. His body too exhausted to fight it anymore. His breathing slowed. His muscles relaxed. Three knocks. Hard. Hollow. His eyes snapped open, his breath caught in his throat. Silence. For a long time he didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then slowly he turned his head toward the door. The handle didn't move. No voices whispered his name. Nothing was there. But Jake knew. It was just waiting.